بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما. Last week we spoke about how when Sultan Abdul Hamid II came into power and became the ruler of the Ottoman Empire in the year 1876, we spoke about how he was able to prevent the Jews from moving forward with their plans of taking over Palestine. For a number of years, he was able to block their plots and their plans. He was a thorn in their side, Sultan Abdul Hamid II, rahmatullahi alayh. Then in the year 1896, so this is 20 years into the reign of Sultan Abdul Hamid. In the year 1896, a man who is known as the father of modern Zionism came onto the scene. And this man's name was Theodore Herzl. Theodore Herzl was an Austrian Jewish lawyer and journalist who formed an organization that is known as the World Zionist Organization. He formed the World Zionist Organization, and he wrote a booklet or a pamphlet that is called Der Judenstaat. And this translates to the state of the Jews. The state of the Jews, or the Jewish state. And he published this work in the year 1896. So Herzl spoke in this work about the problem of anti-Semitism and hatred towards the Jews in Europe. And he said that the only solution for the Jews was to have an independent Jewish state. A state of Jews that is ruled by Jews. He said this is the only way that we can escape the anti-Semitism that is taking place in Europe. So we need to establish, he said, that they needed to establish their own state. And his first choice for where to establish this state was in Palestine. And he wrote in this pamphlet that if it is not possible to establish our state in Palestine due to the Ottoman opposition, specifically the opposition of Sultan Abdul Hamid and how he was making that very difficult for them. He said that if we're not able to do it in Palestine, then plan B would be to establish the Jewish state in Argentina. That was their plan B, that if we can't do it in Palestine, we'll do it in Argentina. So this was what Theodore Herzl proposed in his work, The State of the Jews. So Herzl was able to garner a lot of support from the Jews in Europe, and as we mentioned, many of those Jews in Europe were extremely wealthy. So he was able to garner a lot of support, and in the year 1897, Theodore Herzl arranged the first Zionist Congress in Switzerland. And this first Zionist Congress was basically a gathering or an assembly of Zionist and Zionist sympathizers. And they came together to speak about their goals and their objectives. And they set forth their official agenda. And this agenda became known as the Basel Program. The Basel Program, because it took place in the city of Basel in Switzerland. So they set forth their objectives and their goals in the first Zionist Congress. So, of course, their main objective was to establish a Jewish homeland in the land of Palestine. And they proposed a number of steps that would need to be taken in order to achieve this objective of forming and establishing a homeland in Palestine. So they said, we need Jewish farmers and businessmen to go to Palestine and settle there. Farmers and businessmen specifically, right? Businessmen in order to establish an economy for the Jews there in Palestine, and farmers in order to take over the land. So this was one of their steps. We need farmers and businessmen, Jewish farmers and Jewish businessmen, to go and settle in Palestine. Also, they spoke about the need to organize the Jews and to unify them under this cause, that everyone should get behind this cause. All of the Jews of Europe should get behind this cause, the cause of establishing a Jewish homeland in the land of Palestine. Also, they said we need to promote, they made it a goal to promote Jewish pride and Jewish identity. So they said the Jews should be proud of their heritage and they should be proud of their identity as Jews. And they also spoke about working with the different governments of Europe to achieve this goal. That we need governmental support. We need the support of the European nations for us to be able to successfully establish a Jewish state in Palestine. So these are the things that they discussed in the first Jewish Congress, and it was led by Theodore Herzl, and it took place in the year 1897 in Basel, Switzerland. Now around this same time period, the great scholar Muhammad Rashid Rida, who was a Lebanese scholar who had settled in Egypt, right? He was a great scholar. He began publishing in Cairo his magazine that is known as Al-Manar, right? And this magazine became very popular, and in it the Shaikh Muhammad Rashid Rida, rahimahullah, he warned the people, he warned the Muslims about the dangers of the Jewish plots, and he warned that the Jews are actively taking steps to take over, to eventually take over Palestine and establish it as a Jewish state. So Muhammad Rashid Rida, he wanted to bring awareness to this, to the Muslims, so the Muslims should know what's going on, right? In the year 1898, Theodore Herzl, he held the second Zionist Congress. So this became a yearly thing. The first one was in the year 1897. The second Zionist Congress took place in the year 1898. It was led again by Theodore Herzl. Again, it was in Switzerland. And during this assembly of the Zionist Congress, new goals and objectives were put forward. One of the objectives that was mentioned in the second Zionist Congress is that the Jews should establish their own bank, right? There should be a Jewish bank that supports Jews and Jewish causes. Also, they spoke about the need for Jews to learn and teach their children the Hebrew language. So at this time, Jews were mostly living in Europe, and they had pretty much assimilated into the European nations that they were a part of. So the Hebrew language, it was kind of lost. There were many Jews who didn't know how to speak Hebrew. The language still existed, of course, but there were a number of Jews living in these European countries who didn't speak Hebrew. So in the Second Zionist Congress, one of the points that was made is that the Jews should learn Hebrew and they should teach Hebrew to their children, because their goal eventually, when they wanted to establish a Jewish state, they wanted the official language of that state to be the Hebrew language. So they said that they needed to start taking steps now to revive this language, to learn this language and to teach this language to their children. And they also, again, reiterated the need for more cooperation with European governments to further these goals and objectives. All right, now Sultan Abdul Hamid, he was following these developments very carefully, right? He's aware of what's going on. So in the year 1898, Sultan Abdul Hamid, rahimahullah, he enacted a law prohibiting even Jewish visitors, the religious visitors who would come into Palestine, and he had allowed that. He said Jewish visitors can come, and they can visit their religious sites in Palestine, but they can only stay for a period of 3 months max, and then they have to leave. So now, in the year 1898, seeing what the Jews are trying to do, he made that time period that the Jews were allowed to stay in Palestine for religious visits, he made it shorter. He said, instead of 3 months, I'm going to cut that down now to 30 days, 1 month max, right? So he enacted this law that Jewish religious visitors who come into Philistine, they can still come, but they cannot stay for more than 30 days. And after 30 days, they will be forcefully deported. Sultan Abdul Hamid said that we will send forces, we'll send the military to actually remove them from Philistine if they stay over 30 days. So while Theodore Herzl was making all of his plans with his fellow Zionists, Sultan Abdul Hamid rahmatullahi alayh remained a thorn in his side. Herzl really could not move forward while Sultan Abdul Hamid was the emperor of the Ottoman lands. The next year, in the year 1899, the third Zionist Congress was held. And Theodore Herzl, again, he reiterated that the Zionist objectives, the main Zionist objective is to establish a Jewish homeland in Philistine. So these first three Zionist Congresses, 1897, 1898, and 1899, they were all led by Theodore Herzl, and they all took place in Switzerland. So then after that, towards the end of 1899 and the beginning of the new century, 1900, Theodore Herzl and the Zionists, seeing that they haven't been able to move forward much, they decided to seek assistance from England to help put pressure on the Ottomans, right? Because Sultan Abdul Hamid, he wasn't budging. So they thought, okay, maybe if England was a very strong colonial power at that time, they thought that if they can put more pressure on Sultan Abdul Hamid, maybe it will be easier for us to move forward with these objectives. So they decided to seek assistance from England, and the Fourth Zionist Congress was held in London in the year 1900. Right? It was held in London in the year 1900, and in this Zionist Congress, the fourth one, Theodore Herzl, he praised the British very lavishly. And he said, the British, you are the people who understand why we are trying to do what we are trying to do. And he really flattered the British, right? So the British then started applying very heavy pressure upon Sultan Abdul Hamid and the Ottoman Empire to allow Jews to come into Philistine and settle in Philistine. So Sultan Abdul Hamid, he was really in a very, very difficult situation, being threatened by Britain and also other countries in Europe. The Americans, they started getting involved as well, putting pressure on him to allow Jews to settle in Philistine. And with all of this pressure from the outside, the Ottoman Empire was also going through very severe economic hardship. The Ottoman Empire at that time, it was basically bankrupt. And the reason for that was a few years earlier, in the year 1897, a big war took place. And that was the Ottoman-Greek War that took place in the year 1897. And this was a war that was fought between the Ottoman Empire and the Kingdom of Greece. And the reason behind this war was that the island of Crete, which is about 100 miles south of the Greek mainland, that land, the island of Crete, was an Ottoman territory. But the majority population of Crete was Greek. Most of the people who lived there were Greeks, right? So they wanted to actually unify with Greece. They wanted to unify themselves with the Greek mainland and become part of the Kingdom of Greece, right? So a war was fought for Crete between the Ottoman Empire and the Kingdom of Greece. And this war didn't last very long. It lasted for a period of 32 days, right? So it just lasted a little more than 1 month. And the Ottomans were victorious in the end. The Ottomans won this war. But the cost of the war is not cheap. War is very, very expensive. So even though the Ottomans were victorious, the cost of this war, it basically bankrupted the Ottoman Empire. And they went into very, very heavy debt. They went into very, very heavy debt, and this debt lasted for years. So now, in the beginning of the new century, 1901, Theodore Herzl, he saw the financial difficulty of the Ottomans as a means to gain leverage for his plans to establish Philistine as a Jewish state. Right? He said, okay, the Ottomans are in severe financial difficulty. They're in very heavy debt. Theodore Herzl saw that as an opportunity. Right? He thought that he could talk to Sultan Abdul Hamid and he could offer him money to pay off these debts. And in exchange for that, he could get Philistine for the Jews. This was his plan. So he raised millions from the Jews of Europe. And as we mentioned, many of those Jews in Europe, they were very wealthy businessmen. So Theodore Herzl was able to actually raise millions of dollars from these Jews for this cause. Right? He was able to collect millions. And in the year 1901, he was finally able to travel to Istanbul, and he met with Sultan Abdul Hamid. So Theodore Herzl, he meets with Sultan Abdul Hamid, and he makes a proposition to Sultan Abdul Hamid. He told Sultan Abdul Hamid that he would pay off the complete Ottoman debt. He would pay off the complete Ottoman debt in exchange for Jews being allowed to settle in Philistine. Just lift the ban of Jews not being allowed to settle in Philistine. Lift that ban of Jewish settlement in Philistine. Allow them to settle in Philistine. And Theodore Herzl said that he would pay off all of the debts of the Ottoman Empire. But look at Sultan Abdul Hamid, rahmatullahi alayhi. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have mercy upon him and give him a high station in Jannah. Sultan Abdul Hamid remained firm. He did not let Theodore Herzl buy him out. He did not sell out. And he basically told Theodore Herzl to get lost. He said, I won't sell anything, not even an inch of the land of Philistine, because Philistine does not belong to me. Rather, it belongs to all of the Muslims. And we won these lands with our blood. We took these lands with our blood, and the only way that it will be taken away from us is with blood. We will not give it up just like that. No matter how much you pay us, we will never give up what we got with our blood. Right? So he told Theodore Herzl very clearly that Philistine was not for sale and that he would not lift the ban on Jewish settlement in Philistine. So that was in the year 1901. So Theodore Herzl, he failed in his objective of trying to get Sultan Abdul Hamid to change his mind. And Theodore Herzl died in the year 1904 without achieving his objective, walhamdulillah. He died in the year 1904, and he was buried in his homeland of Austria. Right? So he died without achieving his objective, but he did set the wheels in motion. In the year 1905, a number of the colonial powers of Europe came together for a meeting. Britain, France, Holland, Italy, among others, they came together to discuss, global affairs. And one of the decisions that they made during this meeting in 1905 was that the Ottoman Empire must be dismantled. They realized that they would not be able to further their own objectives in the land while the Ottoman Empire was still standing. So they decided that we must do something. We must take steps to dismantle the Ottoman Empire. So Sultan Abdul Hamid, look at the difficult situation that he's in. The enemies are trying to get at him from all sides. Sultan Abdul Hamid, he was aware that Europe and the colonial powers wanted to break up the Ottoman Empire. So he took whatever steps he could to keep the Muslim lands unified. He wanted to keep the Muslim lands and the Muslim people together. So one of the things that he did was he built a railway that is known as the Hijaz Railway. He built a railway from Damascus in Syria all the way to Medina, with stops in Amman and Tabuk and other cities. And this railway also had branches that forked into Philistine, into the Palestinian cities of Akka and Haifa and Nablus, right? So he actually had this railway built, and one of the objectives of this railway was to physically unify Muslim lands. And with the physical unification of Muslim lands, that would keep the hearts of the Muslims together as well. So this was one of his objectives in building the Hijaz Railway. So the Jews and the Zionists, they saw that they realized that they would never be able to reach their objectives with Sultan Abdul Hamid in their way, right? He had been a thorn in their sides now for decades, right? They're not able to really move forward with Sultan Abdul Hamid as the Ottoman emperor. So they realized that, as long as this person is in power, they realized that they were not going to be able to achieve their objectives. So now they started making plans to figure out how to get rid of Sultan Abdul Hamid. They started making plans on how to get rid of Sultan Abdul Hamid and remove Sultan Abdul Hamid from the Ottoman throne. All right, now within Istanbul, during this time period, there was an organization that was known as the Young Turks. The Young Turks. So this group politically opposed Sultan Abdul Hamid. And one of the factions of the Young Turks was a group that was known as the Committee of Union and Progress. The Committee of Union and Progress. So this was basically an offshoot of the Young Turks. They were part of the Young Turks. And incidentally, Mustafa Kemal, who later became known as Ataturk. Ataturk was not actually his name, right? Ataturk means the father of the Turks, but his name was Mustafa Kemal. So Mustafa Kemal, who later became known as Ataturk, he was actually part of the Committee of Union and Progress. And this was an anti-Abdul Hamid group. The Young Turks actually started as an anti-Abdul Hamid group. That was what brought them together, that they hated Sultan Abdul Hamid. Right? And this Committee of Union and Progress, that was part of the Young Turks, and actually Mustafa Kemal was part of that group as well. All right, so this group, the Young Turks, and the Committee of Union and Progress from the Young Turks, with support from the Jews and with support from the British. They had support because the British and the Jews, of course, are enemies of Sultan Abdul Hamid. And, the Young Turks and this Committee of Union and Progress, they're also enemies of Sultan Abdul Hamid. They hate Sultan Abdul Hamid. So, they thought that, look, we can use these people to our advantage. They hate the same one that we hate. So, if we support them, then they will support us, right? So, the Jews and the British, they supported these Young Turks, and they supported this Committee of Union and Progress. And with that, this group was able to overthrow Sultan Abdul Hamid in the year 1909. The Committee of Union and Progress was actually successfully able to overthrow Sultan Abdul Hamid in the year 1909. So Sultan Abdul Hamid, he came into power in the year 1876. And he was forced out of power in the year 1909. So 33 years he remained firm, alhamdulillah, and for those 33 years, he did not let the Zionists reach their objectives, alhamdulillah. But then in the year 1909, the Young Turks, this Committee of Union and Progress, they were able to overthrow Sultan Abdul Hamid, of course, with help and support from the Zionists and from the British. And then the Committee of Union and Progress took over rule of the Ottoman Empire. After Sultan Abdul Hamid was deposed, the Committee of Union and Progress basically became the rulers of the Ottoman Empire. And of course, a puppet sultan from the Uthmani dynasty, from the family of Uthman, was put in place. Muhammad Rashad, he was officially the new sultan of the Ottoman Empire, but he was just a figurehead. He was just a figurehead and he had no real power because the Ottoman Empire now had been changed into a constitutional monarchy. Now it had been changed into a constitutional monarchy. So the power was really with the Committee of Union and Progress. And Muhammad Rashad, Sultan Muhammad Rashad, was just a figurehead who did not have any real power. So now, with the Ottoman Empire being changed into a constitutional monarchy and the Committee of Union and Progress having the power, with this, the Jews now were finally able to dip their hands into the leadership of the Ottoman Empire. So there were 13 ministers who were basically running the empire now. 13 ministers, and out of those 13 ministers, 3 of them were Jews. Even though the Jewish population in the Ottoman Empire, it was not very big. But they had 3 out of those 13 representatives representing their interests. 3 of them were Jews out of 13. Now compare this to the Arab representation. in this committee of these ministers. 13 ministers, and over 50% of the population of the Ottoman Empire, they were Arabs. But how many ministers did they have representing them amongst those 13? Only one Arab minister out of those 13. And there were 50% of the population of the land is Arabs. And compare this to 3 Jewish ministers, and a much smaller percentage of the population was Jews. So you see this now, the Jews, they started to gain some real power now in the Ottoman Empire. So with the end of the reign of Sultan Abdul Hamid, a new chapter began. A new chapter began with the Jews getting closer to their ultimate objective of establishing Palestine as their homeland. So in the year 1909, the same year that Sultan Abdul Hamid was removed from power, that same year, immediately after the Committee of Union and Progress from the Young Turks took power, immediately that same year, 1909, they issued a number of new decrees. And from amongst these decrees was the decree that allowed the Jews to establish the city of Tel Aviv, north of the city of Jaffa. Establishment of the city of Tel Aviv. It was established in the year 1909, after Sultan Abdul Hamid was removed from power. This was one of the first things that the Committee of Union and Progress did. They allowed the Jews to establish the city of Tel Aviv. Also, they rescinded the law of Sultan Abdul Hamid prohibiting Jews from purchasing land in Palestine. And they made a new law allowing Jews to purchase land in Palestine. Now Jews can buy land in Palestine. And also, they rescinded the law of Sultan Abdul Hamid forbidding migration of Jews into Palestine, and they said now it's open. Palestine is open. Jews can come, they can migrate, they can settle in Palestine, they can buy land in Palestine, they can establish themselves in Palestine. So look, this Committee of Union and Progress, they undid everything that Sultan Abdul Hamid had done in order to prevent the Jews from settling in Palestine. Sultan Abdul Hamid, through these laws that he had enacted, he prevented the Jews from moving forward with their plans. But now this Committee of Union and Progress, these young Turks, they undid all of that within a very, very short period of time. So then, of course, after this, now the Jews started coming into Palestine. They started settling in Palestine. They started buying land in Palestine. They started establishing themselves in Palestine. Immediately after Sultan Abdul Hamid was removed, this started. The same year, 1909. So you can see that Sultan Abdul Hamid, rahmatullahi alayhi, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have mercy upon him, you can see that this man was a brick wall. He was a brick wall in front of the Zionists. But once he was removed, then, and only then, these Jews, these Zionists were able to move forward with their sinister objectives. And with this, a new era began in the history of the Holy Land. And inshallah we'll speak more about that next week, bi'idhnillah. Jazakumullahu khaira wa barakallahu feekum. Wallahu a'lam wa sallallahu wa sallam wa baraka ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in.